I only married you because you're the boss's daughter. My husband, Oliver, said with a smile. His words, delivered so casually, stung like an open wound. I could feel them lingering in the space between us, cutting deeper than any physical pain could. There I was, lying sick in bed, my body weak and feverish, but my mind sharp. I glanced over at the scarves and gloves I had spent months knitting for him, each one a labor of love, now carelessly tossed aside, discarded as though they held no more value than a scrap of paper. I had poured my heart into those gifts, each stitch a silent expression of my affection, each thread a tiny piece of myself, but now, they lay there, completely ignored. As my husband coldly expressed his disappointment in me, he seemed to think I was just a means to an end, that I existed only to serve him and meet his needs. But in that moment, as I lay there, a surge of clarity hit me. If he truly believed everything was going his way, if he thought he could dismiss me like this, I had a duty to show him how wrong he was. The thought of him realizing just how badly he'd misjudged me made me smile, just a small, bitter curve of my lips, but a smile nonetheless. My name is Stacy Morgan, and I've been married to Oliver for 5 years. We don't have children, a fact I never really questioned until recently, but we had, or so I thought, a comfortable life. Oliver, a workaholic through and through, was often away, consumed by his job, and though there were moments of loneliness when he wasn't around, I had always believed in the life we were building together. On his days off, he made sure to spend time with me, and that was enough to keep me content. I cherished those rare moments when he wasn't just the distant, driven businessman but my husband, the man I married. I met Oliver through my father, who was originally his boss. Oliver had always been a hard worker, and when he suggested I become a stay-at-home wife, it seemed like the perfect idea at the time. I had never been one to pursue a career, so the thought of staying at home and supporting my husband while he worked felt right, and with the free time, I was able to fill my days with hobbies, sewing, knitting, and working out. I made friends in the neighborhood and spent my days improving myself in little ways. But it was the sewing that really captured my heart. Every winter, I would make Oliver scarves and gloves. I started out with clumsy attempts, stitching and restitching until my hands ached, but as the years went by, I got better, I refined my technique, and Oliver began to notice. He complimented me, telling me how much he appreciated my work. It felt good to hear him say that, and it made me want to continue, to perfect my craft. Someday, when we have a child, I want to teach them to sew, I said to him one evening as we sat on the couch, wrapped in the warmth of our quiet home. Oliver smiled at me, his eyes softening. Maybe I'll join in too, he said, and learn to sew with you. That could be fun. I remember that moment as though it was yesterday, the promise of a future filled with simple pleasures, of making memories with the man I loved. I never questioned that this life was what I wanted. I supported Oliver in every way I could, managing the household, taking care of everything so he could focus on his work. Thanks to his successful career, we lived comfortably. I felt like I had everything, no complaints, no regrets. But then, 2 years ago, things began to change. It was an ordinary evening, and I was waiting for Oliver to return home. But as I sat there, I suddenly felt dizzy, lightheaded. Before I could even make it to the couch, my legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the floor. The next thing I knew, I was in the hospital, the sterile scent of the room filling my nostrils. Oliver was there, standing beside me, his face a mixture of concern and confusion. The doctor explained that my condition wasn't something that could be easily fixed. It was chronic, something I would have to live with for the rest of my life. The words felt like a punch to the gut, and I was overwhelmed with anxiety and fear. I didn't know what this would mean for me or for our future. But Oliver held my hand and spoke to me in his usual calm, reassuring tone. It looks like you'll be in the hospital for a while, but it's okay. I'll come see you whenever I can. We'll get through this together. His words should have comforted me, and at first, they did. With him by my side, I believed everything would be fine. I would get better, and life would return to normal. But as the days passed, I noticed something shifting. Oliver's visits, which had started off as frequent and full of warmth, grew fewer and farther between. At first, I thought he was just busy with work. I tried to understand, knowing how demanding his job was, but as the months went on, I began to feel the distance growing between us. When I mentioned feeling bored, Oliver would bring me my knitting tools, and we'd spend a little time together. I still held on to the hope that things would get better, but then, something happened that I hadn't expected. I had made him a pair of gloves, as I always did each year. I had spent hours perfecting them, determined to make them the best yet, and when he finally came to visit me after weeks of silence, I handed them to him, my heart full of anticipation. He didn't even look at them. He glanced at the gloves, then up at me, his face cold. "Are you still making these?" he asked, his tone flat. "Honestly, it's getting to be a nuisance." The words hit me like a slap across the face, but they were nothing compared to what happened next. Oliver reached into his bag and pulled out a set of divorce papers, placing them in front of me without a second thought. I stared at the papers, unable to speak for a moment. The realization settled in slowly. He was done. He had made his decision, and in that moment, it became clear that everything I had done for him, all the love I had poured into our marriage, didn't mean a thing. It was all for nothing. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel the rage I thought I would. Instead, a strange calmness washed over me. This was it. This was the reality, and I would have to face it head on. But little did Oliver know, he had underestimated me, and I would make sure he paid for it. "I see, I've got everything prepared, the necessary documents," my father said, his voice tinged with concern. He gave me a faint, troubled smile, the kind that only a father can give when he knows his child is about to face something difficult. "The meeting is set for next week. There's not much time left, but we'll manage somehow." I could sense the weight of his words. As a father, he had always wanted the best for me, and the guilt of having recommended my husband, Oliver, to me all those years ago still lingered in his heart. His anger toward Oliver now felt like fuel, propelling him to do whatever he could to help me out of this situation. But despite his resolve, I could tell that he still cared deeply for me, and his desire to right the wrongs of the past was palpable. "Thank you, Dad," I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside me. I had been preparing for this moment for weeks, and now that it was finally approaching, I could hardly suppress the feeling of satisfaction. The thought of Oliver, sitting across from us, realizing what I had done, made my lips curl into a small smile. For the first time in a long while, I felt a spark of triumph, and for a brief moment, the weight of the past seemed lighter. The day of the meeting arrived, and we gathered at my family's home, neutral ground, where we could discuss everything calmly. The setting felt oddly familiar, yet different. My parents and I sat together, forming a united front, while Oliver sat alone across from us, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. He knew, of course, that my parents were hurt by the divorce, but I couldn't help but feel he had grown indifferent to their feelings. His gaze was cold, detached, as if he had already severed all emotional ties with us. He sat there with the same composure he always did, even a faint, mocking smile playing on his lips, as if he were above it all. His arrogance was almost palpable, like a wall between us. "I'm the victim here," Oliver said, his voice devoid of warmth. He glanced at me briefly, his words dripping with feigned magnanimity. "But I don't intend to demand too much. The proceeds from the sale of the house will suffice." His casual dismissal of everything we had been through, all the pain and disappointment, was infuriating. I could see my father's face redden, the veins on his neck standing out in anger. I placed a calming hand on his arm, willing him to remain composed. This was not the time for outbursts. It was his mistake, and he would have to bear the consequences, not us. I took a deep breath and met Oliver's gaze with steady resolve. "There's something important we need to discuss first," I said, my voice calm but firm. My father slid a document across the table. The paper was a formal record showing that the land on which Oliver had sold the house was still under my father's ownership. This was the key piece of information that would change everything. "Indeed, the house was in your name, and there's no denying that," I began, my eyes never leaving Oliver's. "But the land on which that house stands is my father's property. He still holds the title to it, as you can see in this document." Oliver's expression shifted ever so slightly. He furrowed his brow, clearly not expecting this revelation. "So what?" he scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "The house was mine to sell. No one has the right to complain. Do you really think you can retaliate against me with this?" His tone was dismissive, as if he thought he had already won and could brush off anything I said. I could feel my blood begin to boil, but I maintained my composure. This was the moment I had been preparing for. "It's true that, from a purely legal perspective, as long as the house was in your name, there were no issues with the sale," I continued, "but there's more to consider here than just the legalities. You sold the house, but we still have the rights to the land, And that means my father can demand rent from the family living there now. That's where the real trouble begins. Oliver's face hardened as he listened, and I could see his mind racing. He must have thought through all the legal angles before making his move. But this was an area he hadn't accounted for. I leaned in, my words deliberate, each one designed to make him fully grasp the gravity of the situation. The family that bought the house, they weren't told about the land ownership situation, were they? I asked. Now, thanks to us retaining the rights to the land, they could face significant issues. They could be asked to pay rent to my father. Imagine their frustration, having bought what they thought was their dream home, only to learn that the land underneath it belongs to someone else. They would have no choice but to take legal action against you, since the sale wasn't as they were led to believe. I paused for effect, watching Oliver's reaction. His face had gone pale, and I could see the fear creeping into his eyes as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. He had sold the house without considering the implications, and now he would pay the price. We've already spoken to the family, I said, my voice unwavering. They understand the situation and have made it clear that if this isn't resolved, they will hold you accountable. Oliver swallowed hard, his voice trembling slightly as he spoke. What should I do, then? A small, knowing smile curled at my lips. The family could purchase the land from us and consolidate the ownership of both the house and the land. In that case, you would reimburse them for the amount. Everything would be resolved smoothly. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Oliver had no choice but to agree if he didn't want this to spiral further. But there was more to consider. The problem is, I continued, the land is in a prime location. The value of the land alone could exceed the price of the house. Even if you liquidate all your assets, it wouldn't be enough to cover the cost. In the end, you'll be left with nothing. I watched as the reality of the situation settled in on him, his face draining of color. He was trapped, caught in the web of his own making. Alternatively, I added, my voice sweet but laced with coldness, you could buy back the house and then pay for the land. Of course, you'd also have to compensate the family for their relocation, but, given the costs involved, you might find that you'll end up losing more than you bargained for. Oliver looked like a man on the verge of breaking. He could see no easy way out, and then, just as he thought things couldn't get worse, I delivered the final blow. Don't forget about the alimony, I said, my tone cool. Your actions have caused me a great deal of emotional distress. I plan to claim compensation for that, so, keep that in mind. I let the words hang in the air, watching as Oliver's world crumbled around him. For once, he was the one who would suffer, and I couldn't help but feel a small, bitter satisfaction. The tables had finally turned.